Again, I'm going to take about 5 minutes of questions, and then we're going to jump into our next lesson. Does anyone have any questions, burning or just general from the last lecture? Yeah.
I was a little curious about heat sink. I understand heat, but what's a heat sink?
Yeah. So trees, like I said, are giant air conditioners, and when you have trees cool the air and pavement heats the air. So when you're looking at it from a bigger sort of landscape level, you look at heat generating areas, so that's where you get the urban heat island effect, and then cooling areas, and another word for that is a heat sink. So what that does is it's an area of trees and water, so as heat passes through it, it cools it.
Oh, it's actually different than I thought it was.
Yeah, it's like a carbon sink, right? Okay. So it sinks the carbon into the ground, the heat sinks the heat into the ground. It's a great question, and it's something that you actually have to have a certain threshold of trees to do it, and it matters on the scale, right? So in my yard, my front yard faces south, I've got a garden there, but it's still about 60% pavement in basically a 10 meter radius, so that's heat generating, right? But the backyard is 100% wooded from me planting trees, so that's a very small, there's a 10-degree difference out of my front door and my back door, right? So that's sort of a heat sink in back. So that works for my personal landscape, but it's not big enough to impact my neighbors, right? So that's one of the reasons why we did tree plantings across Southside. So these groupings of trees can provide heat sinks, but they have to sort of be more than just me. So yeah, it's a good question. Yeah.
I realized that, it's good that you did an overview of all the kinds of trees.
Yeah.
But when we actually do tree planting, we'll have a limited palette.
That's right.
Because it's going to be a small space.
Right.
And
yep.
so at some point in these sessions, will we focus on some of those trees a little more?
Yeah, so she, what was your name again? Sorry.
Robin.
Robin asked, I just did an overview of the types of trees and gave you 4 examples, but at some point we have to narrow it down, right, to just the trees we can plant in a small space, right? So there's 2 ways to approach that. One is to look at, for me, I go to the native plant list. So there's one, the UNC North Carolina Botanical Garden has a nice list. NC State sometimes has a nice list if I can find it, I'm sure. Ashley can help you. So you can pick out your plants in advance based on the size and structure and needs, right? So usually what I'll do is I'll look at a space, do the site assessment, be okay, I need 1 big tree, 2 small trees that can take a lot of sun and heat and have poor soil. And then I go to those and I pick out 3 of each, right? So these 3 big trees, these 6 small trees. The next question is where can I actually buy them, right? And so that's when I go to the nurseries and I have to say, okay, these are my preferred, do you have any of these? You don't, okay, what do you have that meets these? So one of the reasons why, so I did a whole hour-long class for the Raleigh Garden Club, and it was only trees, and these are all the trees. That's really fun, but it's not all that practical because at some point everyone's oh, I love yellowwoods. I love yellowwoods, right? Can't buy yellowwoods really. I've ordered them from Virginia. So does that answer your question? So this was kind of that species class, but feel free. I'm always here. Yeah.
Is there a medium growing, pretty fast growing?
Yeah. So maples are the ones that you think of medium growing, fast growing trees. They only grow fast if you give them soil. So trees only grow as fast as the soil they're in. And I'll give you a good example. I have, in my neighborhood, we planted 2 sycamores and 2 nuttall oaks. 1 sycamore and 1 nuttall oak in my yard, and 1 sycamore and 1 nuttall oak in my neighbor's yard. So, and both of my neighbors was a rental house, right? So outside of literally the tree planting, they got no care, and our trees got good care. So they plant same trees, literally the nuttals were clones of each other, and the sycamores were trees that we pulled up from a different place that were this big first year and planted them. The first year, so the difference is, for both of those, we dug this big hole, so 3 times the size of the root ball. We fill it with a mix of topsoil with a little bit of compost. We covered them with about 1 inch of triple shredded hardwood mulch and watered it in, all those trees. So in my yard though, where we planted in the backyard, we had tilled up all of the soil, mixed in compost in the entire area. And covered it with 8 inches of wood chips 2 years in a row. So lots of organic matter over a wide area. First year, none of the trees really grew. They grew about maybe 3-4 inches. The next year, the Nuttall oak and the sycamore in my neighbor's house grew about 3 inches. The Nuttall oak in my yard grew 5 feet, and the sycamore grew 10 feet.
Wow.
The following year, which is this past summer, the Nuttall oak in my neighbor's, or I guess this is 3 summers in. The Nuttall oak in my neighbor's house is about 15 feet tall. It's about 1.5 stories, so maybe a little bigger. The Nuttall oak in my yard is about 25 feet tall. The sycamore at my house is about 35 feet tall, and this is 4 years old. And the sycamore that we planted is about 10 feet tall. It's in a really bad space. So so when people are like, "What's a fast-growing tree?" I try to temper it in that way to be like, it's all about the soils.
A little experiment.
Did you,
Yeah, it's a nice little experiment.
did you say you dug the hole 3 times bigger than the root ball?
Yeah, and we'll go through that in
Not
just a
2
second.
times, as you might with perennials or something, but 3 times bigger for a tree root ball?
Yeah, so-
Depending on how big the root ball is?
It really varies based on what you can dig, right? So bigger is always better. We
Yeah.
try to say 3 times for a tree, 2 times for perennial, because we're like, this is an ideal that a lot of people can do. But to be honest, in some of the situations, even getting as big as the root ball is a struggle, right? But that's also going to be a struggle for the tree. So we just do the best we can. And that's why the example there, yes, we planted it ideal for both of them, right? Ideal for a tree 3 times the root ball. And so that tree is growing 15 feet for a tree after 3 years. That's awesome in most places, right? And that's because it was planted really well. It's not 25 feet, not 35 feet, right? And that's because it wasn't just that hole that was fixed, it was the entire space that it had to access for its roots. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So I wish I'd taken pictures. That would have been smart. Not the smartest tool in the shed, or whatever that saying is. Last question. Yeah.
I just want to say faster might not always be better, the wood might be weaker on your tree than the neighbor's.
That's true.
And a
What is-
nicer windstorm or a nicer windstorm might snap off and blow over.
Right. So what she said is faster isn't always better, right? So trees need to make a trade-off between growing tall and growing strong, right? So that is true. Sometimes some of the fastest growing, in general, faster growing trees have typically weaker wood because they prioritize tall over strong, right? So they can either grow tall or fat, unlike me. I'm never going to grow tall, so I have one option, right? So for trees though, some of that is genetic, right? So a sycamore, the 2 sycamores that are there, the one, let's do the oaks. The 2 oaks that are there. My oak did prioritize growing taller, so in some ways it might have weaker wood compared to the oak that grew shorter. The difference there though, the reason why that grew shorter is because it wasn't able to access as much nutrients, it wasn't able to get out, it's not as healthy, right? So while it is true that tree probably did prioritize more strength down there, it didn't necessarily do that because it was prioritizing strength, it did that because it just didn't have as much to work with. So what you said is right. If I'm looking for a tree that's going to be much stronger, I'm going to choose an oak over a sycamore, right? Because oaks typically grow slower, they put on more wood for storage, they put on more wood for strength, than the sycamore that's just shooting for the sky, right? It's racing for the top. But when you're looking at the same species under similar growing conditions except for soil, a tree that's growing slower in poor soil is actually going to be weaker because it can't access the soil outside of its hole, and so it doesn't have as big of a root system to hold it into the ground when wind comes. Does that make sense?
Did you do a soil test before you planted?
So I have a different view on soil testing because I work primarily in trees. So in the extremes where it's something that's very acidic or very basic, really no tree is going to survive that, and that's what I would consider like a contaminated soil. The question is, did I do soil testing before planting my trees, right? So if you have here's a really good example. Duke University on the quad, they built a railroad track down the center of the quad to get the bricks from the quarry to the quad to build the buildings. And then once they were done with railroad tracks and all like the stones and everything they put under there, they just covered it with dirt, right? Because they're not going to haul all the stones back out to grow the quad. So there's like granite, but there's also some limestone chunks under there. Limestone is a very basic stone, right? And it's not everywhere. There's just like a chunk of limestone in the middle of the quad underground. And the way I know this is because we planted, I believe it was a scarlet oak, and I should get this species right. Let's go with scarlet oak, but that's probably 80% correct, 20% I'm lying to you. But it's an oak that's very sensitive to the acidity of the soil. It cannot take basic soil. So it's planted right over this limestone, and it turns neon green about July, because that's about the time when it can no longer take the basic of the soil and it can't get the nutrients anymore, right? So in that case, we tried to keep adding soil acidifier, but there's limestone there. It doesn't matter how much sulfur or whatever I add, it's just always going to be basic. And so in that case, it would have been good to know because I would have planted something that was more tolerant to basic soils. However, outside of like kind of an extreme soil contamination situation, for the most part, most native trees like more acidic soil, which your clays are, and more than the pH is the organic matter content that matters for the survival of your tree. So you really want to make sure when you're planting, no matter where you're adding in compost about 10%, so 10 to 1 compost. Make sure you've added topsoil if it's really just all clay. And then you want to add a lot of wood chips or lots of really nice organic matter on top to help encourage the soil to become alive.
Yeah.
Because what happens with the trees as they're growing, they put sugar out of their roots, and that sugar does two things. Primarily, it feeds soil creatures, and those soil creatures, as they poop, defecate, as they do the thing that soil creatures do, they actually create organic matter and make the soil more neutral. So the more organic matter and compost that are in there, the more alive, the more the tree can survive, the more sugar it puts out to complement that organic matter, the more creatures are in there, and the more neutral it becomes, and the more living the system is. And that system right there is called the rhizome, and that's the part of the tree that's the most alive. So even if that soil started off pretty acidic or somewhat basic, as it becomes alive, it moves towards more neutral, and it moves into the acidity that the tree needs in order to survive the best. Because trees are like people and beavers. They actually terraform their environment around them to make it so that they can grow correctly with the conditions given. And just like us and beavers, they need the right conditions in order to terraform most correctly, right? I can't really I'm not like a pig. I can't build a house out of straw really well, but give me some bricks and I'll hire someone to do it because I still can't build it out of bricks.
Thank you.
All right, so we're going to skip ahead from the soils because our fabulous cooperative extension specialist did all the soils for us. So this is a little bit, I'm going to start here and then we're going to move into planting. So I like to show this picture because it shows you like the above ground is really important, this is what we're going for, but a healthy below ground soil has all of these different things within it. And when we plant a tree, we think a lot about biodiversity up top. Like we like the birds and the bees and the butterflies. Just as important, if not more so, is cultivating the biodiversity underground, right? And each of these things live in a different layer of soil, like Ashley told you, right? So like sort of the deeper part of the soil is sea horizon, which has a lot of bedrock in this area. It's pretty deep because we mostly have clays. The B horizon, that's got some organic matter. The A horizon, that's like that nice mixture, and the leaf litter. So we really need to be aware of making sure we have stuff to feed the fungus and the bacteria that are breaking down, that are being fed by the tree through the sugar. Some trees, when they're under stress, can put up to 20% of the energy they make from the sun into the sugar coming out of their roots. They're really calling for help in that case, right? This is a big cost to them. If I spent $1 out of $5 on a personal secretary, like, I'm really needing some help. I don't know why I went for that. I don't have a personal secretary. Ants are above and below ground. A lot of people don't think about burrowing animals as being important, but they really are. Those create major pathways. Like, everyone hates moles and voles. I get it. They create little lumps, but that really helps aerate the soil, right? So earthworms do little aeration. There's a study looking at crop roots, and actually where some of those bearing things were, even though they were eating their rootlets, because of all the soil and water, of the air and water bringing to the roots, those crops could flourish. So we often misinterpret what's going on underground. Anyway, neither here nor there. So when we're planting, we just need to think about trees really need to be a part of a living ecosystem, and that's what we're going for. So this is an example of a plant with mycorrhizal fungi. Thank you so much. Apparently the coffee didn't kick in correctly. So the yellow are the tree roots, and the white is the fungus that's wrapped around the roots. Who here has heard of mycorrhizal fungi before? About half of us. Beautiful. 98% of plants on this planet are feed and are associated with fungus that wrap around the roots. So this fungus is called mycorrhizal fungus, and that's just a fancy way of saying root fungus. Plants have to have fungus in order to thrive. They can somewhat survive. They look really wimpy and die quickly, but in order for a plant to thrive, it has to have an association with a fungus. It's just like me. When I'm on a lot of antibiotics and it kills all of the stuff in my stomach, right? Like, I can survive without having fungus and bacteria and all the things in my stomach that helps me digest food. I can survive without it when I kill it, but I'm pretty sickly, right? It's when I'm living my fullest life and eating yogurts and drinking kombucha, whatever the hippies like me do, right? Whatever we do to fill our stomach with like living creatures, that's what helps me thrive, and that's the same with the trees, right? So that fungus is fed by the tree, but it also needs that the air and water and organic matter in a good soil in order to survive. Make sense?
Yep.
The other thing I will say is trees are not just doing it for, they're not like, yay, fungus, woohoo! They do it because they're a little cutthroat and they need the fungus, right? Fungus makes it easier for them to access nutrients, water, it helps them fight off pathogens. Last story, then I'll get to the tree planting part. I did a research project in undergrad on a Christmas farm up north where we poured probiotics for the soil. It was just like, it smelled like, I called it stinky cheese. It smelled like sticky trees. In strips on a Christmas farm. And then I dug up the rootlets to see how it worked and everything. So every 3 weeks I would go up there and pull out Christmas trees and examine the rootlets to see if it colonized and count how many whatever percentage of roots, because I was a student and my professor didn't want to do that, so I was doing that. So I did that until about July, and in July I go back to the farm and every single tree that had not gotten this treatment was dead. Every single one. And all the ones that had gotten the treatment was alive. The farm had been infected by a fungus called Phytophthora cinnamoni, which is a major Christmas tree pathogen, and so we had to abandon the experiment because there was no more control group, right? So that's the difference that a good fungal colony can make.
So it was a particular probiotic that you were combination of different bacteria that they came up with that they thought would be good for trees?
Yeah, so we were studying a specific combination of probiotics. There's a bunch of different type of mycorrhizae of beneficial fungus. Not a lot of people grow up being like, man, I can't wait to study soil fungus associated with trees in a specific area. So we actually don't know a lot about this, right? There is some research, but we don't know, like, for example, we know things like chanterelles, right? And what are truffles, right? We know these very specific human important species are associated with certain trees, but like we can't even control those very well. We have no idea about fungus that is specifically healthy for the trees at all, because we haven't looked. Yeah, Jimmy, do you have a question?
Yeah, do you have to, do these naturally occur, these funguses, or do you have to like manually?
Yeah. So there's two parts to that. One is if you build it, they will come, right? It's like the field of dream for fungus. So if you build your soil so it's really nice and fluffy, yes, it will colonize because the spores of fungus, like their eggs basically, float around the air all the time. It's like, everyone take a deep breath. Breathe out. You just breathed in chanterelle fungus, right? So like it's everywhere. We breathe it in. It's why we have, such an intense immune system. However, it's also true that that's not true for all fungus. So some of it has to be brought in by other creatures. So ants are a big colonizer, a bringer of fungus that are beneficial. Some of it just lives in the soil. We don't know how it moves, which is why it's so hard to create like truffle farms, right? So we could take all the parts of the truffle and stick it in the ground, but we don't really know why it doesn't work, but it does. That being said, it is true that inoculating your soil with healthy soil makes a massive difference. So that's the idea. I'm going to use humans because I think about that. It's easier for me to understand. Before I took antibiotics, I had a really healthy soil stomach. I had a really healthy stomach, right? Because I ate a lot of fiber, right? I was vegetarian, I ate a lot of salads, a lot of fiber. I fed the things in my belly what it needed to survive, right? So that's like a forest that has a lot of organic matter. Fiber is organic matter. It's the exact same thing, right? It's just like plant matter. So then I got Lyme disease and I took very heavy antibiotics for a year. That was the construction site coming through and bulldozing everything, right? So now there's nothing living in my stomach. The soil on the construction site is just clay. There's nothing living there. If I take probiotics, if you go and dump some of that stinky cheese on that clay soil, there's nothing for it to eat, right? So those will go in there, they'll survive and starve and die. Goes right through, right? Same thing with the trees, right? You plant a tree in clay and you add fertilizer or you add the probiotics, it's gonna starve to death because there's nothing for it to eat. Even the tree's having trouble feeding it. Once you create that nice juicy soil, once I start eating a lot of the fiber again, as I take probiotics to do that, now there's something for it to grow in. I'm mixing up probiotics and trees, but are y'all getting the concept? Okay, so that's the answer, as much as I can. And that's why for some people, once they really do a lot of soil modification and plant the trees, they'll go and get like a bucket of soil and dump it in there. Because you get the fungus, you get the bacteria, but you also get springtails, thank you, springtoads was not right. Springtails, things like that, right? So you get some of like the bigger creatures too. That's that. Okay, we're gonna go a little quickly through this so we can get to the demonstration. So there's a lot of different types of trees that we plant, and we all want to basically, the goal of it is to maximize root to soil surface area. We want the roots and the soils to be really close together. Once again, low functioning words today, apologize. And there's a bunch of different ways that we can get trees, and all of those are gonna look a little bit different in the whole, but they all function, like the same goal is there. We wanna make sure the tree is planted in a big hole with a lot of space with good topsoil and some compost covered with organic matter. So this is an example of a couple different types of trees that we might plant. So this is called a ball and burlap tree, and it's because the root ball is covered in burlap. We're pretty simple folks as tree people, right? So whether it's synthetic or 100% cotton burlap, it will not biodegrade in the soil. Carl was telling me a great story of how he was managing a golf course down in Fairview? Finley Golf Course, thank you, sir. And basically, this dog would die, he dug it up and it was still in here, right? I've seen trees that have been in the ground for 10 years that still have the burlap. It does not biodegrade, you have to take it off. These are bare roots. Basically, it's grown in wood chip beds or gravel beds, so they pull it out and there's no soil in the roots at all. And so when you put it in the ground, it just looks like that. And then we've got container, which basically looks like a violet pansy. So we talked a little bit earlier, when you're digging a hole for a tree, the ideal is to get it 3 times the size of the root ball. Y'all remember what the trees look like below ground?
Wine glass and a spaghetti.
Thank you. Wine glass and a plate of spaghetti.
I love it.
I love it. That's how I remember it too, right? So we don't want to be a kid and dig a hole to China like I tried to do, right? Not helpful for the tree. We want it to be wide. And that's what you're seeing here, right? These nice wide holes so that the roots can really spread out and start establishing correctly. Next thing you want to do is make sure we've got good topsoil organic matter. So this is soil that's had the addition of some compost. They put some wood chips on top, which is good. You don't want to mix the wood chips in it, but you do want it on top. So you want up to 10% compost. Any more compost than that, your tree is going to start leaning over. Once the tree gets established, you're going to have about 5 to 2% organic matter in the soil. So if you put more than 10% in there, it's going to shrink a lot and your tree will lean. So this is what a bare root tree looks like. So it often has a lot of nice soil or a lot of nice feeder roots depending on how it's done. They're grown in these wood chip beds. So the city of Durham used to plant a lot of bare roots because they're light, they're cheaper, they're easy to transport, but when you're planting them, the roots can dry out, right? It's sort of, they're naked, they don't have like the soil around them, and so it's a lot harder. It's harder, right? They're all by themselves, they don't have anything to buffer them going in. But they are easy to transport. So that's one type of tree you might end up planting. The next type of tree you might end up planting, or you probably will end up planting, is a container tree. So the benefits of these is they're easy to grow, right? They're a potted plant. We get a wide variety of trees. We see a container tree right here. There's a bunch of different types of containers that they can grow in. The most common one is that. It's just a hard plastic side like this. But there are some other ones that you can get. So for example, I've heard a lot, I like to order ones with the air slits on the sides so that air gets around the roots, and I'll show you why in a second. There are some that are biodegradable or compostable. These hard plastic ones aren't really, right? Maybe they're biodegradable in the compost but not in the ground. There's some that are actually biodegradable, more like those peat pots that you get for doing tomatoes. You don't get a lot of trees in there though because they would biodegrade as the tree grows. So just a bunch of different types of pots. And here's sort of the results of growing in different places. I'm sorry, do I need to move the tree down? Can y'all see over on this side? Okay. So in black plastic containers, what happens is the roots will grow out and then hit the container side and turn. So what you get is this bullseye pattern of the roots basically hitting the container and grow, but this tree didn't start in this pot. This tree started in a pot about this big. So what happened is the tree was in the pot, it hit the roots hit the outside of the pot and it grew in a circle. Then we put in a bigger pot. And then it hit the outside of that pot and grew in a circle. And then we put in a bigger pot. And then hit the outside of that pot and grew in a circle. So now what we have is a tree this size, but actually it has this bullseye pattern of rings from being sized up into different pots. Does that make sense? So the problem is we don't want trees with bullseye patterns because as that trunk grows, it'll start hitting those circles of roots and strangling itself. Sometimes trees can graft root bark to trunk bark, but they're really totally different barks, right? Root bark lives underground. It likes it wet. It doesn't really like the sun as much, right? Trunk bark lives above ground. It doesn't like it wet. It does like the sun. Very different tissues, right? That would be like trying to graft, I'm not gonna make something up because it'll be gross. Anyway, don't wanna do it. So that's happened here. Root pouch allows a little bit more air to get it. So basically, we'll actually go to the air pot. With the air pot, what happens is there's a lot of air getting around to the roots. So what the roots will hit the air, and instead of turning, like thinking it's a rock and can just go around, it thinks it's at the edge of a cliff. So it actually just bursts into like a firework feeder roots. So with this, the tree still thinks it's in nature, right? So it hits this and it's like, oh, it's a rock. I'll just go around the rock, right? But for the air pot, it hits the air and it's like, I'm at the edge of a cliff. I'm gonna turn into feeder roots and try to grow elsewhere out of other roots. Does that kind of make sense? So what you get with air pots is more feeder roots and less of those big structural roots, so it makes it easier to plant and you've got a better root form. And this is somewhere in the middle. So the root pouch, which is a cloth pouch, allows some air quality. And this is what happens if you don't fix the roots, right? So you can see what that looks like when you wash off the soil, how twisted those roots are. You can see what that looks like when you plant it, how it starts to strangle the roots up top. And you see how flat this is right here? That's a result of the root strangling it under the ground, right? So you get these long-term deformities, and it actually makes them more likely to fall over in hurricanes. So it's really important to fix that. It's also not good, I've seen more and more of these like above ground plastic containers for ease of watering or whatever, the same thing happens, right? We're not gonna plant a lot of these ball and burlap. So the nice thing about this is 100% of the roots go in the ground, right? All of the roots are right there. Ball and burlap are grown in fields. Actually, I'll show you this. They're grown in fields. And then when we're ready to plant them, we use this big machine called a root spade to literally dig them out. So they lose about between 90 and 95% of their roots when we do this. But at least they've got good root form, right? Because they were grown in a field. So they're very, very heavy because they've got all this soil in them. They've got great soil structure. They also have more healthy critters in the soil, right? Because it's real soil. It had real biology in the soil. So there's sort of a trade-off there. We plant containers, they're lighter, they're easier to carry, but we have to worry more about the soil or the root form. A lot of places will plant ball and burlap. You can get bigger trees. They require more care, but they can survive better with good care.
Were you there with these, and did they take off the burlap?
You have to remove the burlap.
I know, but I'm just saying, I'm just wondering if that did actually happen. I mean, I'm sure it doesn't happen all the time.
So Alice was asking if I've been there. So when I manage trees and I'm there helping plant them, I do make sure that they remove the burlap and the wire cage. So you don't have to take it all the way off the tree. You want it 2/3 off, and you can tuck it on underneath. I like to remove it all because I don't like planting trash, which is what you do when you do that. But most trees there's like a couple different root forms for trees. So, like here's this. Can you all see this? There's a couple different ways trees form roots underground. Here's a pine tree. Pine trees tend to have more of tap roots, although only the longleaf pine actually retains this tap root where there's a lot of sandy soils. And it's funny because like out east where the sandy soils are, they'll have roots that look like this. So it'll be a tap root and then a bunch of feeder roots and stabilizing roots and feeder roots and stabilizing roots and feeder. So what do you think this is related to?
The soil.
It is the soil, so this is 100% sand.
Yeah.
So this is the water table moving up and down over the years, right? So at low, when there's not a lot of water, they'll get feeder roots down here and then move up. This is a special case. Most pine trees will start with a tap root, but it's really hard clay, right? So then they come out and their roots sort of more look like this. They lose that tap root very quickly. So then you've got hardwood trees. See, this is, you can tell I'm an artist, right? So hardwood trees start with tap roots, but they lose it very quickly. So a lot of hardwood trees have what's called this heart-shaped roots system. So they start doing roots sort of more like this. So that's a heart shape, so that's why we like to dig the whole sort of dig. The other type of root system they have is actually just all the way flat, right? And they'll have some of what's called sinker roots to help keep them in.
It depends on the type of hardwood.
Depends on the type of hardwood tree. Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah. That's super geeky. You don't need to know that for the test. Last little piece, because I want to give some time to do this stuff. So you all should have a handout. I helped write this for Carrie. I do love Carrie. I know that Carrie gets a rough where they, I know that Carrie gets a rough reputation. That's fine. They first got their rough rep. Who here has been in Durham for more than a year? Keep your hands up. More than 2 years. More than 3 years. More than 4 years. More than 5 years. Awesome. So we're going to stop here. All of you have your hands up. Do y'all remember, you can put your hands down, but do y'all remember the news article that was in the News and Observer that said, Durham folks come over to Cary to break into cars? No? No one? Durham folks in Chapel Hill robbing houses. Durham gets a rough reputation. Cary started that, right? Breaking into cars. Yeah, so Cary for a long time is not like Durham. Durham for a long time is not like Cary. But I think we should be friends. Anyway, so they have a tree giveaway. We wrote this. So this is going to be like your step-by-step for planting trees. And I'm going to go over this out loud. So this is for you to take home. If you want to read it while I'm talking, that's fine. You are probably better than I am where you can read and listen at the same time. I cannot do that. But this is for you to take home so you don't have to take notes. And in the back, we've got like this diagram, right? So the things that are really important to know when you're planting a tree is A, you want the tree to be planted straight up and down, right? Oh, God, this is... I'm just weak, friends. I'm sorry about that. So we want the tree to be planted straight up and down. There's a part of the tree where the roots, the trunk bark turns into the root bark. That's called the root flare, and it's called a root flare because the trunk flares out, the roots flare out, right? Like I said, we're simple, folks.
Like a wine glass.
Like the wine glass, that's exactly it. That root flare, where it flares out, is trunk bark. So, does the root flare, knowing that, does the root flare need to be above or below ground? That is correct. So, when your tree looks like a lollipop like this, you see how it goes straight into the ground with no flare? That means the root flare is buried in the soil in the pot, which is true 99% of the time, right? So you want the root flare above ground. Once you expose a root flare, you want that to be flush with the ground. In this area, we used to plant it about 2 inches higher, and that is still okay. The reason why is because with the clay soils, it can hold a lot of water, so people wanted to give, they built up the soil to give the tree a chance to sort of root in before really facing that hard, wet clay. It's okay to do that. It's not ideal to do that because a better choice is just to dig a big hole and modify the bed so it doesn't sit in water. You want to loosen that big soil. You want to loosen the soil even outside of the planting hole. So if you dig your hole and you're like, I'm really tired, I don't want to dig it any bigger, just take like your shovel and just break up the clay around it to help create some of the paths to let water and air in. A lot of people used to ask me if aerating the soil helped using like an aerating machine. Those are actually not good for trees because there's 2 types of aerating machines. One is the tine one, right? That sort of like pokes holes in the soil, and what that does is it compacts the soil all around those holes. So the trees can't really access that soil. The second one is it pulls plugs. That also creates holes, but it also compacts the soil around it. So you really just need to break it up with like a backhoe or a potato fork or whatever else. All right, so we're gonna sort of start from the beginning a little bit. Normally we would do this outside. So we're gonna dig the hole. How big of a hole do you want to dig it?
3 times.
Do you want it deep or wide?
Wide.
Y'all are fantastic, man. A+, gold stars to everyone. We're gonna do that. So in this area, we have really clayey soils, like really thick. So North Carolina is known for bricks and pottery, right? That's fantastic. So around here, what happens to clay when you press it, compress it, compact it, and then heat it? It turns into bricks, right? So what do you think has happened to our yards that have been run over by bulldozers and exposed to the sun? It's turned into a brick,
Yeah.
right? So when we dig out a hole in this brick, what are we creating there? A hole in a brick, which is basically a brick pot, right?
It's a pool.
Yeah, it's cool, not ideal though. So what we want to do is after we, what?
It's a pool.
It's a pool, thank you, with a P. Much better. It is a pool of water. and then we put nice soil in it, and then it just pools full of water, right? So it's really important when you're digging your hole to take a shovel and break up the edges of that pot to allow some water to start infiltrating into the sides of that pot. So I think of it as breaking up a brick pot, right? So you dig your hole and then you break the edges of a pot, and that allows soil, allows air, water, and roots to get into that size, right? And hopefully you've also sort of put your shovel all around to help break it up further. So now we've dug our hole. Next thing we want to do is take our tree out of the pot and sort of look at it. This tree looks pretty good. There's some roots around the side, but if this is like most other trees, it's gonna probably have some of those root deformities we talked about, right? Because it's not just from this pot, it's from earlier pots. Dogwoods aren't as bad at this. Other trees like maples are the worst at this. So the faster the growing tree, the more likely it's gonna have those, they're called girdling roots, which I think is a terrible name for them. I call them strangling roots. But anyway, those roots. So what we want to first do is expose the root flare to see how deep in this pot the tree was planted. This is really nice, loose soil. So almost all plants, almost all trees are not planted in soil. What they're planted in is potting medium, which is usually a combination of really finely done pine bark in compost or nitrogen with some sphagnum moss. So peat and sphagnum moss is used often to lighten the soil because it's really tough carbon material. The bad thing about that is it's all lined, and by using sphagnum moss, we're actually where those are growing are really great carbon sinks. So it contributes a lot to climate change to use sphagnum moss, and it's not really necessary. So I recommend against using that. But nurseries don't always take my recommendations for whatever reason.
You go pretty far down.
Yes, it
Yeah.
can be pretty far down. So I've already dug a couple inches. What can be really scary or challenging when you first start doing this is you're like, I'm really hurting the tree. And you are. And sorry. The tree will make it through. But it's not like brushing hair. It feels like it. But in the end, you're sort of breaking bones to set them right, if that
Yeah.
makes sense. So you don't want to tear out roots if you can avoid it.
Yeah.
But you do want to do your best to set the tree up for success. All right. So we are seeing the root flare. Usually a good way of telling where the root flare is where the top big roots come out. But sometimes trees will grow roots a little bit higher because the soil is so high, they're like, oh wait, I need to adapt to my conditions.
What did you just say, Katie? That sometimes
Some-
is it lower than you were expecting, the crown of the tree?
That's a good, let me repeat myself when I'm
Okay,
not
thank
out of
you.
breath.
Yeah.
One second. So when you're looking for the root flare, one good way of telling it is where that first big root comes out. That's usually a really good sign. Because trees of this size, it can be hard to tell, right? So this skinny, 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 it's sort of getting a little fatter here. And this is where it's really fat, right? But sometimes trees kind of look like lollipops all the way down, because trees. And so a good way of telling is looking where that first big root comes out. On occasion, you'll have smaller roots, they're called adventitious roots, growing right out of the trunk. And that's because the trunk was buried underground and the tree was like thinking to itself, oh, I grew beside a stream and it flooded and deposited all the soil here, so I bet as well get used to it, right? So that's a tree's like sort of thought process as much as trees think. In that way, they think in a different way. But anyway, that's what it does. So you don't look for the small ones, look for kind of the bigger chunky roots. And where that first root is, that's gonna be your root flare for the most part. Make sense?
Could we come up for just a minute and look at it?
Yeah.
Yeah, y'all come up and take a look and then sit back down just so everyone can see. Ask any questions as you go. I mean, if we can all fit around this table, we can just do that.
Would you like me to manually read it? Assuming like that.
I'm sorry?
Would you like me to?
That's cool. This is the root you were talking about.
That's what I'm talking about, yep. So if y'all can all get around this table, come over on control this table.
So this is the
That's it.
flare, so
Yeah,
you're,
pretty much.
this is to be above the ground. and
That's correct.
This part, this
Well,
at ground
So,
level. Yeah.
can y'all all see?
Yes.
Let's just do, this is awesome. Who said that? Thank you first.
Yeah, it's just helpful,
No, this is
visually to
great.
remember, we're gonna.
I appreciate it. If you move over here, y'all can come closer over here. I definitely don't bite unless asked. Okay, so here is that first major root, right? So it was buried up to here, right? So that's pretty deep. But it's also, that's where you can see like that lollipop feeling. And even when I pulled it out here, you could see there's still more to go.
Maybe that's why they did it that way, right? Because
Yeah.
they just was looking at the lollipop
Yeah.
still.
Another reason they did that, so this is called Cherokee Princess. So when you're looking at a tag, so you never want to leave your tags on the trunk because it can strangle it. So if you want to remember what your tree is, you can put it on like a branch, right, for later. But when you're looking at a tag, what you'll see at the top in dark is from Great Spain, genus species. I remember King Philip came over from Great Spain. Do y'all know that saying? Kingdom, phylum, class.
Order, family, genus, species.
That's it. Yep.
If you're into a saucy one, the one I was taught by a grad student when I was an undergrad, TAs, man, keep putting condoms on for greater safety.
I feel like then I'll be saying like condoms for greater safety in classes. So maybe I shouldn't say that, but I will never forget it.
You gotta read the room.
So greater safety, genus, species, right? Cornus Florida, Cornus is the genus and Florida is the species, right? And then afterwards in these things, apostrophes, are Cherokee Princess. So that's the name. That means it is a clone. It's a clone. Names are clonal varieties. And so this right here is where they cloned Cherokee Princess onto a different rootstock.
Wow.
Right? And so you
But
see
we don't
that
know
line?
the rootstock, do we?
No, I don't know. We don't.
Yeah.
That's right. It matters a lot when it comes to horticulture.
Okay.
So if you're doing permaculture, you want, for example, the pear tree I got was a full-size pear grafted onto a medium-growing rootstock, so it would only grow like 25 feet. But you can get them on like dwarf pears are grafted onto dwarf rootstock.
Okay.
So that's really important. This is not as important. But basically I bring this up because you don't want it to trick you, right? Because there's this line and it gets much bigger right here, right? But that's just because it's cloned on, this is the trunk of the other tree that it's grafted onto. So we want to get down to that first root where it's bigger.
Katie, what happens if you have no clue about any of this and you just go ahead and just stick it right in the ground?
Yeah, so what happens, so this is trunk bark. Trunk bark likes dry conditions. And so what happens is, and this is true if we just leave it like this, where it's either got soil, it rots. The way I put it, if it's either soil, this also happens with mulch volcanoes where there's mulch on it. So you basically have dead wood next to live wood. They say it's like putting a zombie finger on your finger, like a corpse finger on your finger and tying it on, right? Like bad things happen. You get fungal infections. You have the trees puts out more adventitious roots, which they're not strong roots. So it's a lot of
strangle happens too that way, right?
Yep, strangles happens a lot. So it's bad for the structure and the health. Trees will do everything they can to survive, right? So like you see a lot of trees planted like that and they're doing okay. You're just not getting the health and the size that you want. The other thing is, as climate change happens and the environment's more stressful generally, we're gonna have, those things are gonna be more important, right? So you'll see trees in a landscape that all look like they're planted the same, some die and some don't. And some of that's gonna be because as climate change happens, the stress from the heat and the drought and flood is gonna hit the ones that were already kind of struggling more.
I had someone in a nursery say to me, plant high, never die, plant low, never grow. And he wasn't saying that it's not possible for a tree to die anyway, but his point was, don't plant it below the crown of the tree below the soil.
Yeah,
Make sure it's
and
properly.
that goes back to the idea of like sitting in a pot, right?
Yeah,
So
and you said 2 inches above can be okay, but in the south here, I wouldn't do that in my yard just because of unless I was careful about the mulching
Yeah.
and, drying out.
And the reason why is because it dries out, right?
Yeah.
So I don't recommend doing it.
Yeah.
I don't yell at people. So the other thing we want to do is start going around the edges. This is pretty light soil. This is not soil, right? This is fertilizer and wood chips. But it's pretty light, so it's pretty easy. I usually bring one of these along to help sort of like loosen it up. Stuff goes flying, which is why I'm not going to do that now. But what you'll find is, you see this? It's got that just like a right angle turn, right?
Wow, yeah.
So that's those girdling roots, and you'll see a lot of those. So you have two options. One is you can sort of put it back and out. What you want to do is have all of your roots be like spokes on a wheel, right? So if you can, and I have, you just sort of twist it around and put it in. Tree roots are very determined, so they'll keep going in whatever direction they're facing, right? So if you leave it like this, it'll keep going like that, and it'll keep curling. If you pull it out, it'll go like that. This is a pretty small tree. These roots are pretty flexible, right? So I can do that. If you can't, just clip it. And you are going to lose some roots, right? But remember, those ball and burlap trees lose 90% of their roots,
Wow.
right? So as long as we want to keep as much of these roots as possible, but if we have to remove a few of the larger roots that are girdling, that's okay.
Oh, okay, so if it's just gonna continue to grow this way and you can't, then you would cut that off.
That's what I would do.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
Sometimes you get particularly maples, but any fast-growing tree, it'll be all the way around. I see red buds, like all of them are like that. That's where you see people take shovels and cut 4 directions there, right? And so that's just gonna cut all of them all the way in. And that's a lot. That's major surgery for a tree, right? It can survive. Wherever you cut the tree, like say you cut it right here, what's gonna happen, say it's like this, right? This is the root. You cut it at the elbow, so this is what's left. It's gonna go like that. So it puts out a whole flush of roots right at that tip, and it'll sort of spread in all directions. So that's what will happen. That's why we cut it there, right? Because we wanted to stop it from turning like that, and we wanted to start going more open in all directions. So we're gonna basically try to do as much as we can. If you get to a point, you don't want to make it a bare root tree. You can, it just needs a lot more care, right? Because the more we pull all this stuff off, the more we're breaking up roots, the more roots it loses. What we're really trying to do is just feel for any of those like strangling roots. For a smaller tree like a dogwood, it doesn't matter as much because they're only 30-year trees, right? For a bigger tree like an oak, it matters a lot because those are 100-year trees, and we really want to make sure it has a big root structure to grow in. So once we've got it, we go from the bottom too, because we want to make sure we get to where the root ball is. And you'll see we've already removed a ton of that soil. Thank you. Oh, that's so much. Thank you. So this pot, sometimes I just shake it to get it out, because this is not soil, right? We want to plant it in soil. All right. So what we'll do, you can put it down there. Where's the pot? Right here.
And you said this was fertilizer and wood chips mainly?
Yep.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm getting dirt on the ground. So this is the difference in size, right?
Oh, yeah.
So if we were to dig the hole first, you only want the hole as deep as the root ball. Before we did this to the tree, we'd be digging a much bigger hole than we needed to, right? So in reality, we only need the hole to be about this deep.
Is it problematic to have the hole too deep, or just wasted effort?
Yes and no, right? So when you have the hole too deep, you can't plant the tree that depth, right? Because it would be underground. So what you can do, and what a lot of people will do, is actually take clay and build like a little platform to put the tree on, stomp it down. And the nice thing about that, when you do it like that,
You mean add soil under?
so you want to use like not topsoil, you want like clay or something that's really strong.
Unless you
So
don't
it doesn't
have
go
clay
down.
where you are, really.
Whatever you have.
Yeah.
Basically, you want compacted soil underneath it. So
I
say you
see.
dug a hole this big.
Oh,
Create a platform to put the tree on, and then you fill the whole hole with nice soil. And now when it rains, the water goes under there more, right? So there's just more stuff, which is good. But remember, the roots aren't really going to go down that much, right? right? So they're still going to want to go wide. So that's why I say yes, it's a little bit of wasted effort because like this much of the hole isn't really going to be used by trees, but no, it's not because it also just generally provides more soil, right? For me, because I used to call myself a lazy gardener. Now I've told I'm a strategic gardener. I tend to use my effort to go wider, right? So now that you have this,
Should this same process be done more or less with putting in a bush?
perennials, yeah. So there's sort of a blurry line between shrub and tree, right? It's a better line between annual and perennial. So most perennials would prefer this type of process. Shorter lived perennials is not as important than longer lived perennials, right? And like you get into this trade-off between like root, the more you do with this, see how this is much closer in, you see how this has got a right turn? So this, if y'all can see this is one root right here that it basically splits here and goes on two angles. So this is from that smaller pot that it was growing in, right? So this is where I would really try to sort of pull it out and tamp it in because this has got a lot of root hairs on it, right? So like these bigger ones are the stabilizing root. These little ones are the feeder roots. These a tree can grow and get rid of like every month. So this is a very active moving part of the tree. I used to think it sort of stayed all year, but this is more very exploratory. And then imagine when it's in the soil that this is all the yellow, the white coming out even further. Those move daily, sometimes even faster, right? There are some funguses that actually trap and eat springtails that are attached to trees. So very cool, right? So once we get this out, we're going to put it in the hole. I actually like to keep this and mix it with my soil, right? So there's something to think about. Those green things are the fertilizer pellets that they put in here. I got sidetracked on a different story. Very quickly. Trees feed the fungus because the fungus brings in nutrients. When you put nitrogen in there, the trees are like, I don't need to feed the fungus anymore. Stop feeding the fungus, and then the fungus dies, and the trees eat the fertilizer. Two things happen. One is, without the fungus just doesn't just bring the tree nutrients, it also provides protection from disease, remember? So now the trees are more vulnerable to root diseases, particularly other types of predatory fungus, right? So it makes it weaker underground. The second is the tree's like, woohoo, nutrients, right? And grows a ton of really nutritious leaves. What likes really nutritious leaves? Bugs. Sunlight, yes. Bugs like really nutritious leaves because now bugs are like, woohoo, buffet, right? And so you get more pest problems. The other thing is nitrogen forces leaf growth. And if you put a tree in the ground and it grows a bunch of leaves and it doesn't have a lot of soil, bad things happen, right? It needs more water than it can get. It's just like, so typically it's not great to fertilize young trees. I don't like fertilizing trees at all with chemical fertilizers. That's where using like compost tea or compost, which is a fertilizer. It is an organic fertilizer. Secret, all fertilizer is organic because it's all made out of carbon, right? So organic fertilizer kind of is not a useful term. Compost is really useful because that has low nitrogen, low phosphorus. It still has some, but it has the jumpstart of the creatures and the stuff that the creatures eat to put in there. So you can mix this with the topsoil, just being aware that you'll want to, there's just a lot of fertilizer in here, so just be aware. Mix it in. So you're going to fill the hole back up. You're going to put it up to the size. You want to cover all the roots and just cover with the soil the roots barely, right? So you should be able to kind of see a little bit of the structural roots, that first structural roots. Just make sure that you don't put any, I'm pretending like this is soil, right?
So
Like you don't
Katie,
put any soil actually on the trunk. Yes.
You would, even though this indicates they use nitrogen in here, you would still use this, you just wouldn't add fertilizer. Is that what you were saying?
I would because I sort of conserve stuff like that. I
Sure.
don't want to throw it out.
Yeah, I just want,
But yeah,
Just
Yeah.
a small percentage of it.
It's a tiny percentage, right? So if I've dug a hole this big
Yeah.
and I usually have 2 bags of topsoil and 1 bag of compost, and I mix that with the soil
Right.
that's there.
So that's a small percentage.
Yeah, exactly. And then I tend to spread it out across the ground too, right? Because there's way more soil than was in the hole originally, and there's a tree. So I spread it way out. Don't make a little lip. So that's a little old fashioned. People used to make like a moat around the tree, which is fine because they did it to make it easier to water. And in like a commercial setting, you need things to make it easier to water. We're not commercial settings, right? So we want it flat. The other thing is if you do that, you have to knock it down later because otherwise like water can't get in. So we leave it flat so that way it's easier for rainwater to get in case it doesn't get water on the regular basis.
What if you're on a hill?
On a slope, that's a good point. You do want to build it up on the downslope side a little bit. Yep, and that helps with erosion. So after this, you're going to put you want to put some sort of mulch on the top. The mulch that I like is arborist wood chips. You can get them for free. They're very coarse.
Are they a mix of pine and hardwood?
They are whatever the tree was that they cut down.
And can you be sure that it wouldn't have pine beetle
Yeah.
bark chips in it?
So that's the number one question I get.
Yeah.
And we actually did a lot of research on it because people are scared.
Oh.
So for the wood chips, it's what we do is we take down dead or diseased trees, right? So it's got pine beetles or lots of fungus in it or whatever killed the tree, right? And then you get sort of scared because you're like, oh, well, then I'm putting that contaminated wood right around a new tree. Intuitively, it makes sense. The thing is the process, those things that are in the tree need like a whole tree with the moisture content and sort of like the livingness of it.
The life, yeah,
Yeah, the life of it. So when we chip it up, it creates these chunks that dry out. So it basically kills the fungus, it makes it so the bacteria and all the bugs leave. And then when you put it around there, we keep it away from the trunk,
Right.
so there's no transfer.
Always, yeah.
The other thing that people were really worried about, rightly so, is the nitrogen, right? So we're putting just carbon there. So
Yeah.
I got a lot of questions, doesn't it pull the nitrogen out of the soil? The answer is right where the tree, that carbon is right where the mulch is touching the soil, there is a layer where there's a nitrogen drop, just right on the surface. That's what you want because that's where weed seeds germinate, right? So you don't want nitrogen right where the weed seeds germinate on the surface. And the tree roots aren't really just on the surface, they're gonna be underneath. So you don't have to worry about that either. But that's why we don't mix it in with the soil,
Right.
Because then you have nitrogen drops all through the soil. So you want hardwood chips, you can do as thick as 12 inches, that's a lot. I usually do about 4 for the arborist wood chips because they're very coarse. If you're buying mulch at like Stone Brothers or Barnes or Lowe's or wherever you buy your mulch, you want it much thinner, only about an inch or so. And the reason why is, you know how that's really dusty? So that dust sort of locks together to stop water from penetrating. So once you get more than 2 inches, it becomes what's called hydrophobic, which means water repelling. So you only want about an inch.
So triple shredded would be more of an inch or 2 inch max.
Yeah, that's right. Triple shredded is more of an inch or 2 inch max.
I
Like
just
Alex
had a
said.
question on the soil. When I dig a hole in my yard,
Yeah.
the soil is like, bricky,
Yes.
big clumps.
Yeah.
So is that okay to put back around
Yeah.
the tree? I mean, just these clumps.
Yes, those are, yes it is. So I'm gonna present it's 12:05, so if y'all need to go, I apologize for running over, please go. I'm gonna stay here for another about 5 to 7 minutes to finish this up, and then I can stay until 12:15 to answer questions. Does that sound okay? All right. So you asked about basically the thick chunks. So having those claws can be really helpful for soil structure because it's a little bit like adding big rocks and water will move around it and things will add it. You just don't want huge ones. So I'd bring them up to about golf ball size or less. But definitely don't try to make it like a tiny, I've spent a lot of time doing that, it doesn't really matter. But yeah, and that's because of the way that our yards were treated when our houses were built, it sort of compressed all the structure out. Great question. So we're gonna put our mulch on, we wanna leave, people say like 2 by 2 by 2, 2 inches away from the trunk, up to 2 inches thick and 2 feet out. If you need that, I'm less exact, I just keep it about a fist out and then put up to 2 inches and as wide as I can. You want it at least as wide as the canopy.
Is 3 inches away okay, or is
Yeah,
that too much?
absolutely.
That's usually what I do, I try
3
to
inch-
follow that.
Yeah, 3 inches is fine. You just want it to cover the majority of the roots, right? Because what the mulch is doing is it's keeping it cool and moist, which is what the roots want. So after that, if you're volunteering with us and we're planting like urban trees, it's going to be in a commercial environment. We're going to put a trunk guard on there to protect it from weed whackers. You don't want to stake it unless it's in a high wind environment, because as the tree moves and flexes, it puts on more wood where that movement is. So if you've planted it well, when you're planting, you want to tamp it down with your foot gently. You don't have to jump it, the tree's not gonna run away, right? But you do wanna like make sure it's firm. And you might give it like a little wiggle to see if it moves a lot, right, at the very end.
Do we have to worry about 811 when we plant?
Always, before you call 811, always.
Oh,
811.
for electrical lines.
It's electrical, gas,
And
internet,
Yeah,
water. You're less likely to hit, so some of the gas lines in Durham were planted really high. For example, at Duke University, one of the contractors didn't call 811. They weren't doing a major installation, they were on like just a very little one, dug about 2 feet down and cut the main internet line for the hospitals.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Another guy was going around with a sounder, just like it was literally a big pole sticking in the ground and hit a gas line. So like, very important to call 811. Yeah, so call before you dig, always. It's super easy, they're super fast. You can actually, I don't even call, I go online.
Do they come out or they just?
Yeah, they'll come out and mark it. Give them about a week, and every different organizations will mark it.
You go online and fill out a form and then they
Yep.
come out? Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Super easy.
Yeah.
They're because they want to not have you destroy your stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so after that, we watered in. We don't stake it, and it's good to go. A couple things about watering. I always get this question, like, how much do I water? The thing is, if this is planted on the south side of a building, bricks, versus the one on the north side of the building, surrounded by a yard, which one's going to dry out first? The south side. So what's going to need to be watered more frequently? And the way we know, and this is super scientific, so get ready, take your fingers, stick it in the soil, and if it's dry, it needs water, and if it's wet, it doesn't. Right? And I know that sounds really silly, but that's the best way to do it. If you're looking for a rule of thumb, if it's in a really sunny space during like the fall and spring, you want to water it about once a week, right? And during the summer, you might need up to 2 times a week, maybe even 3 if it's a really hot, droughty period. But if it's in a cooler space, you're looking at every other week, and then up to once a week during the summer. So that's a general rule of thumb. You want to water it deeply, not shallowly. You want to water in the coolest part of the day. So usually in the evening, because what happens is biologically, in the morning, the trees are waking up. They're using whatever reserves they have, and about midday they shut down because it's too hot. So then in the evening, when it cools down, they open back up, and over the night, that's when they refill everything with water. So that's like biologically why it's better to water during the evening. So I am stopping now at 12:10, only 10 minutes over. Sorry, Ashley. I'm gonna sort of end the class now, but I'll stick around for a couple more questions for 5 minutes. So thank y'all so much. Really appreciate it.